Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming to our first of our July webinars. So I'd like to introduce to you to Phil Adams. Now, we're having some technical issues, so you won't be able to see him, but you will be able to hear him. So over to you, Phil.
Thank you. Well, hopefully not seeing me isn't a bad thing. I think for those of you that can't see me, you should be able to hear me okay. And apologies for the technical issues. I have a rolling wheel of death, or however you want to describe it. But thank you for joining us today. I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. So I'm Phil Adams. I'm a health and safety consultant. I run an independent consultancy based in Cambridgeshire, and have spent 20 or so years involved with health and safety via compliance, and in particular, quite a lot of time dealing with training and the work associated with competency in terms of frameworks for staff in various businesses I've worked with. So hopefully as we go through today, I can introduce you to the competency framework. I'm not literally just going to give you just an overview of the document. I'm going to talk about some of the problems that we might foresee that are coming through, but also give you an indication of some of the wider issues that you may have moving forward, and how this framework might fit within your own businesses or your work within a role, whether that's in-house dealing with fire and safety risk management, or alternatively within a position working as a consultant. If there are any questions that come through today, then please fire them over to on the chat function. We might not be able to answer them all today, but certainly we'll come back to you, and I'll answer as many questions as possible. So Julie, if we can just change slides. Okay. I'm not sure if that's been done yet. Can you just confirm, Julie? Thank you. So I wanted to
It has, yes.
It has, yeah. There's quite a few clicks that you're going to need to do, unfortunately. So what we're going to do is we're looking at the industry as a whole, and kind of I think about when I first started in the world of health and safety, and I enrolled onto the NEBOSH course for fire safety and risk management. I probably was a little bit naive to understand the complex range of different associations, membership bodies, and just kind of the depth and knowledge that some of these groups have and influence they have on the wider industry. So going back to 2005, when we had the introduction of the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, a number of these organisations already existed. But there are some newer organisations that have come through, such as the UK Fire Association, the Institute of Fire Safety Managers, and various other groups. And these member organisations have, really been created and developed in an attempt to support the wider sector. But the problem that we've kind of started to see is that the sector is so broad and so vast, there needs to be some sort of central point to how we manage fire safety risk. And not one of these organisations has a single go-to foolproof kind of plan. And I'm a member of a number of these organisations, and we've spoken quite widely and openly about this. So as a kind of a sector, we need to get to grips completely with the complex needs of fire risk in our country at the moment, but also we need to understand how all these organisations can help and influence and drive forward change. And as the industry wasn't really able to put in place a single self-regulation governance on fire risk management, the government has essentially stepped in and said, well, look, as a sector, how are we going to move forward? So we can do a slide change. So I have a couple of questions, and you can click onto the question. There we go. Thank you. I have some questions really, and this comes from some work I was doing recently, and the work was based around some fire extinguisher service and maintenance. And this question here, why wouldn't you commission a new extinguisher, kind of got my attention. And the reason it got my attention is because I didn't see a reason why you wouldn't commission a new extinguisher. I put this question to a social media page, and it talked about the fact that maybe the technician was in a rush, maybe the technician didn't have the right skill sets, the right knowledge, maybe the job didn't have enough money on it. And various different things came out of it. But it's the same as risk assessments, isn't it? Why wouldn't we undertake a thorough and comprehensive risk assessment? And when we start to think about who we appoint to undertake tasks, whether that's the basics of service extinguisher or maybe a more complex task with risk assessing, why wouldn't we do it properly? If you go to the next slide, please. And I guess the second question then came out of it is, well, if we don't do the first thing properly, what other risks are we creating in our building? And what we found is that within the workplace that we're trying to assess, there's these red canisters, or sometimes silver canisters, dotted around the building, and we as risk assessors kind of take it for granted that they're the right extinguisher, they're in the right location, and they're dealing with the right risk. And I'm going to come a little bit back to this as we go through the presentation. But the reason these extinguishers came to a head is, as you'll see in the background, behind those two pictures, you've got a picture that says for electrical fires, and the one on the top right-hand side was a water extinguisher, which was for Class A fires, our paper cardboard. And most risk assessors would be able to assess that risk. But the reality is, a company's gone in here, they haven't commissioned the extinguishers properly, as you can see, the blue securing tags on the pins, and they've simply put foam everywhere. So why would you replace a high intensity? So one of the reasons I'm focused on fire extinguishers is because they are an essential but a small part of the knowledge and the skill set that fire risk assessors need to have. And whether it's a company policy to put the wrong equipment in, or whether it's down to financial kind of gains for organisations, essentially what we have to do as risk assessors is try to look at the bigger picture, take that step back, and advise as a competent person what the best method and way forward is for an organisation in order to ensure they have a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment. So just skip to the next slide. Okay. Is that done, Julie? So when we think about the competency and the industry, we need to kind of get to grip with what's going on out there. And as my presentation was titled Turkey Twizzlers, the answers to those questions that you have in front of you varied somewhat. The answers that I got were quite surprising. I was told things like, this is the way that it's always been done, so we just put foam extinguishers everywhere. And we've been doing this since the 1990s. Well, the reality is we must be able to do better. We must have a more complete solution to when we're advising organisations about fire risk. And my thoughts were, we ate turkey twizzlers in the 90s. They were all the rage. They were all over the TV. But I don't think, to my knowledge, anyone really eats them today. So just because that was the way we worked in the past isn't necessarily the way that we're going to work in the future. So we must do better. And doing better is where this competency framework comes in. Whether the competency improves someone's knowledge to do with fire extinguishers, whether it improves knowledge to do with the escape distances in a building, whether it's more complex issues around fire engineering, evacuation of persons with disabilities, whatever the case is, we as risk assessors need a competency framework to help us. If we go on to the next slide, and it should be question 3, and this is, do we expect fire risk assessors to understand the basic principles of reportable fire extinguishers? And the answer is, yeah, I think we do. I think all fire risk assessors need to understand a bit more than Class A, B, C, D, and F. They need to have an understanding of what those numbers mean on fire extinguishers. So where it says 13A, what does that 13A mean? when we look at the training that we've been on, does it really give us the depth of knowledge, the information that we need to go away as a risk assessor and say there is enough here? And competency of and the framework that's being used now is really focused on making sure that the training people receive is not only thorough and comprehensive, it allows people to make judgments based on best practices. And when you see these A ratings or B ratings of these numbers, are they meeting the statutory minimum duties? And I don't think a lot of courses that we have out there really satisfy that requirement. They just tell us that we have a piece of equipment to do a certain job, not something that's more complex, maybe. So if we can go on to the next slide, which will get into grips. So with getting to grips, we really have to look at the Fire Sector Federation. This is kind of the starting point, really. And the Federation is a non-for-profit, non-government organisation that has essentially been created to support the industry, to act as a forum for discussion of fire-related issues. And all of those organisations that I showed on an earlier slide, it's bringing those organisations together. And what it's trying to do is it's trying to look at all aspects related to fire. And in particular, obviously, we're looking at the competency framework and say what is the skill set, what is the framework that fire risk assessors should have. And this will have a huge impact on the wider sector in terms of what is the training sector doing to meet these duties, and it will be for training providers to look at this new framework and state whether their courses are adequate. Because at the moment we'll look at providers and awarding bodies like ABBE, you might look at NEBOSH, you might look at FireQual or any of the other kind of qualifications out there. And whilst they sit as a framework, they don't meet the requirements of the new framework and benchmark standards that we're looking at today. And next slide, please. National framework. So, just as an overview, just to give you a bit of an idea, the framework that we have in place has been really designed around two other documents. And one is for individuals, so it's the approved code of practice, and the second is the competency fire risk assessor framework in a guide to choosing a competent fire risk assessor. And whilst these guides have been created, I remember when the consultants register was created for health and safety practitioners, and it was very much led against the backdrop of this will help, this will aid, this will support people in making a choice in who they select as a consultant to work with them as an organisation. But that's not really happened, and at the moment there's probably 850 registered consultants on that framework. Now, with fire risk assessment, because it's in the public news, it's in the public eye, it's something that we're considered, there is more likely to be a drive towards a national register, which is already in place as we speak. But that drive will then help organisations to choose what risk assessor and person is going to support their organisation. So this is the real starting point, not what we've done in the past, what we're doing now. Working together will drive improvement. It will drive improvement in critical areas of fire safety, in particular in fire risk assessment. There'll be focus on standards, competency, and it reasserts those foundations really that have been created by the fire risk assessment industry or sector, that competence and independent third-party accreditation for both competency of individuals and of companies is really the way forward. But obviously with that comes additional cost. So industry's fire risk assessments, or the risk assessment sector, will start to find that they need to demonstrate competence in a number of different ways, whether that's flying a flag against a third-party assurance, such as UCAS, or whether that's going down a registered scheme, such as the tiered fire risk assessment schemes. It's down to each company to decide. So next slide, please. what we have now is a set of organisations that are broken down into registration bodies, third-party assurance, and registration schemes. And these are all linked. These are all on the linked to the Fire Sector Federation's benchmark standards for fire risk assessors. And these are not maybe the ones that will be there in the final kind of draft. These might change as time goes on. But anyone that's seeking to use a fire risk assessor should use due diligence. They should choose a fire risk assessor to ensure that assessor that they select is competent in the task. But the reality is that many will select an assessor based on cost, based on the relationship they have with that organisation, based on trust or referral, not necessarily off the back of one of these schemes. But we are seeing a change where more and more businesses and organisations are looking towards one of these schemes to say, "Are you on there?" without really knowing what do they mean and what do they. So in the UK, we have two organisations that most of us have heard of. Certainly one of them will be UCAS, United Kingdom Accreditation Services, and then the Engineering Council of the United Kingdom. They're the two kind of third-party assurance schemes that we recognise as the kind of the benchmark holders almost. They're the ones that define whether somebody has met that risk. But underneath that, a number of schemes that don't use UCAS, such as tiered fire risk assessors from the IIRSM, fire risk assessor registers from the IFE, those sorts of things, they have their own set of standards, but all of those standards meet the scheme as a wider framework. So next slide, just the pathway. So as individuals or as companies, if we're going to move towards an industry or a sector where we have better understanding, better conformity, that competency of that fire risk assessor, or the competency of the company undertaking the fire risk assessment, will mean that everyone's met these baseline controls. And the baseline controls for fire risk assessment go back at least a decade before they were set out in the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order. And to support that, the government progressively sought to improve the landscape, including that fire safety order, but other requirements that we've had since the tragedy at Grenfell, in particular, with the introduction of the Fire Safety Act, the Fire Safety and Regulations, and then we've got other documents like the Building Safety Act requirements. Once somebody has got onto or been through one of the schemes or a UCAS independent verification, in either case, they end up on this national list of fire risk assessors. So if we can just skip to the next slide, please. So the national listing, regardless of what scheme you have applied to, once you have been approved by that scheme, part of the membership is that you'll be put onto this list of fire risk assessors. So a bit like the Consultants Health and Safety Register, all of the organisations that feed into this network will have their name, the business, and their level of membership or type of membership for certification added. So this will then become the kind of portal for trying to establish and find who is registered and who isn't. Now, the problem with all of these registers, there's a number of people that are out there in the wider risk industry that maybe would meet the requirements of the register. They just don't want to be on there. So I don't think, and I doubt very much, that there will be a piece of legislation or a drive that will make it a mandatory requirement at this stage that all fire risk assessors must be nationally recognised and on a national register. I still think that's an undecided area. We'll see what happens in due course with the consultation with the Home Office and those that are involved in developing these standards. Next slide. So industry benchmark and standards for fire risk assessors obviously vary significantly. They are developed by the Fire Sector Federation and provides practical guidance for the fire risk assessors. And at the end, I'll show you where you can find the link to this document. They provide practical guidance for all fire risk assessors to really understand where your gaps are, a bit like a gap analysis, and what sort of buildings you are able to potentially assess. The standard identifies through varying criteria 3 distinct core levels for individuals, not company, competency for those undertaking general fire risk assessments. The 3 levels intend to provide a pathway. So when you start in the industry, if you're starting as a very entry level, new to the fire risk assessing world, or new to risk assessing as a whole, it will kind of show you where the limitations are until you have that skill set, that further competence regarding your knowledge, your experience, the training, etc. But essentially, this benchmark standard for fire risk assessors will start to fulfil the legal duties and obligations and responsibilities for fire safety under the Regulatory Reform Order, or Fire Safety Reform Order, or other legislation that we have from Northern Ireland, Fire Safety Scotland regulations, and etc. And what that would do is it will really mean that there is then risk assessments that are created that can be defined as being suitable and sufficient. Next slide. So how do these standards work? Well, for many of you that have joined today, it's really understanding your own gaps and what do you possibly need to do moving forwards. And if you've not looked at the document that's been produced by the Fire Safety Federation, the standard doesn't necessarily work as a complete standalone document. It will still work alongside existing British standards, such as PAS 79, that methodology for risk assessments. And it will align to other British standards within the 9980 series, 8414, and so forth. And it's about having a suitable and sufficient approach to risk assessment, something suitable for the environment that you're assessing. So the industry benchmark standards provide this means to establish a set of quality standards, and in practice required by those employed within the sector to respect those provisions and to ensure fire risk assessments are suitable. So it's prepared by fire risk assessors who are members of an industry response group. Essentially, it's a competent steering group. And I was with one of the members of this steering group a couple of months ago, and we're talking about some of the challenges that may move forward. So I think there will be lots of challenges that we can't even foresee yet with these standards, but it's important we get ahead of the game to really understand the liabilities and risks we may face moving forwards. These principles underpin the existing Fire Safety Federation's approved code of practice. They set out personal qualities, which is something we've not really looked at before. When we've looked at competency for risk assessors as a more kind of general industry standard, we've looked at competence as a qualification. Maybe the background of that individual is something based around experience in the sector, such as used to be work for the fire and rescue service, or they had fire experience. But we've not really looked at these personal qualities. What is it about the individual that they have, their attributes, to be a fire risk assessor? Because when we think about most fire risk assessments, they're looking at life safety systems. So they're essentially protecting people over property and buildings in most cases. So moreover, what we find is that the standard considers the activity, the profession, and it's created distinct levels, which you'll see at the bottom of the screen here. And we have that foundation, or that entry level fire risk assessment. That was within what a low risk premises is. And what you define as a low risk premise and what I define as a low risk premise will obviously differ based on our own perception of risk, our willingness to engage with the property owner, understand the tasks, the activities, the type of standard of compliance they have in other areas of risk. We then have our intermediate And the intermediate risk is based around the kind of the general requirements for fire risk assessments in what is a medium risk premise. And straight away, I start to think about, well, how do we define what is medium risk? How do we understand what is an intermediate risk? And those medium and intermediate to me mean very different things. Is it the activity? Is it the building? Is it the people that are vulnerable? And that in itself is quite a broad subject matter, which I don't think is always perfectly clear. And then we've got advanced, and advanced is conducting fire risk assessments in what we would define as a high risk premise. This is where we tend to have larger scale activities, or maybe it's a low volume of people, but the chances of a fire are fairly regular. So in some sectors, such as the waste industry, waste and recycling, often where waste disposed of, people disposing of waste incorrectly, like putting electrical items that are battery powered into general waste. So lots of fires on a daily basis might mean that you need to have that better understanding of how risk is dealt with. But then that becomes less fire risk assessment and more how you control the fire from advancing once it's started within the environment you're working with. So from these kind of three groups, foundation, intermediate and advanced, the risk assessment standards move to look at how do we kind of create a property risk kind of category or framework. So next slide. And this property risk category framework actually is quite a handy tool for us to decide how we're going to kind of calculate and assess risk. So if you've not seen this before, I think the first thing to do is to say, well, look, what is it that you're assessing? What are the type of buildings that you commonly undertake a fire risk assessment in? And whilst you might be quite comfortable and coherent with the environment, do your qualifications, does your knowledge, your expertise, does your skill set really allow you, based on this framework, to assess these buildings in a particular way? And we will go into these in a slightly more detail as we go through this presentation. But when we think about the fire risk framework and what type of properties we're assessing, very rarely do we always have all the information available. So to ask a building owner and occupier, what is their travel distance to a nearest exit? You know, is it below 20 meters, below 30, below 60, above 60, or is it complex? They're going to need some support. They've probably never measured them before. They've probably never worked them out. But what they will possibly have is a previous risk assessment that was done by someone. That might help. But really, even though we might have longer travel distances, you could have a complex of issues. So lots of buildings that I work in commonly will have travel distances in excess of 30 meters, and they will have less than 10 employees. They might only have 4 or 5 employees. So, you know, where do we set the risk assessment now? Is it a medium risk assessment? Is it low, or is it simple? Because that 30 meters could actually be 40 meters. Depending on the environment you're in, these standards don't always work. But really, this should start to be used as a trigger point for you as a risk assessor, the type of buildings that each of your staff within your organisation can assess comfortably, or if they are new to risk assessing, where they might need guidance and support and to be shadowed. And gradually, as we move through the competency framework, that will grow. So these fire risk categorisations require systematic assessments. There's a quantifiable and qualitative factors within the framework, and therefore the simplified kind of stratification overview might not work. We need to think about the travel. Is the travel of an internal distance excessive to the final exit, or a place to a place of ultimate safety, or is the travel distance actually leading of an excessive route to a place of relative safety within the building? What are the protected routes? And we don't sometimes know this information until we've got to site. So these are lots of questions that asking a potential client or looking at a building manager to provide you with actually can be quite challenging. We also need to look at the spread So as you'll see here, the spread, and this isn't looking at surface spread and necessarily the exact fire load within the building, but the spread is really looking at how we can become how the fire can become involved and how much area of the building can be kind of covered. So it's really looking at the compartment size as opposed to the fire load as a specific detail. We also need to look at the height of the building, and obviously the height is the height measured from the ground level access, usually from firefighting points. So if you've got a building on a slope, it's not necessarily from ground level. It might be from floor -1 or the basement -2, something like that. But whether they're occupied or not, and lots of buildings will have basement stores, like pubs, those sort of areas that aren't really occupied, and you would need to make a decision to say whether that comes into the height of the building or not. And I also think that, for some buildings where you've got 7 stories plus, they don't necessarily fall into the high risk category, just because of the nature of their use. So again, there's some variance. We also need to look at the hazards that are present. What is there beyond the work environment? Are there high risk activities or risk activities such as oxyacetylene cutting, flame cutting, welding? What sort of hot works, grinding, those sort of activities? Or is it just the storage of large quantities of flammable goods? Now, you could argue that whilst this framework looks fairly straightforward, that bit about hazards, well, that's the bit you're assessing. So you start the assessment thinking it's a fairly medium kind of risk type building. But this framework, whilst you're there, you realise actually this falls into a high risk category. And then that's down to the assessor saying whether they've got the authority and competency to do the risk assessment or whether they may need to walk away. And we also finally need to look at the construction. What sort of construction is it? Is it a traditional brick and block work? Is it steel frame structure? Is it modular? Are there external wall cladding systems, which obviously are a big problem? Or is it an old kind of design building with thatch roofs and other combustible elements that are in the building? And all of these things will then have an impact on whether the risk assessors going out can assess that property. But the question I always come back to is, who are you sending out? What risk assessor is going out to these buildings? So it's important we show a little bit of due diligence prior to getting an individual in too deep, should we say, putting him into a scenario where there's too much going on. Next slide, please. So we're going to have a look at some of these definitions a little bit more up close. So we've got these categories for fire risk assessment that we've just seen, and they're fairly well spread out as a risk category: simple, low, medium, high, and very high. And with these risk categories, not only are we looking at the risk that we may foresee in the building, but we have to look at the type of persons going out to assess these buildings and understand what do they mean. So one of the things that we have to look at is within this framework, where it's been developed, it uses a term called simple risk, which is kind of maybe our low risk building. And when we introduce legislation to appoint a competent risk assessor, it might have been advantageous to, at that point, give a better definition to what simple risk premises are, because if we talk about simple risk, and much of the guidance that we find on the local fire rescue brigade's website in your borough or county, what you'll find is with their guidance, much of it will say if it's a simple premises and it's simple risk, a manager or someone with risk assessment experience should be able to undertake the risk assessment themselves. Whereas this is potentially leading away from that. And it says here, using a simple risk kind of framework, a small traditional constructed building no higher than 2 stories with a floor less than 100 meters squared, occupied by 10, or a small traditional constructed building, often 2 stories no higher than 3 stories, with a floor around 100 meters, occupied by 10 or less persons, excluding any basements. Well, for most people, they'll say, well, I'm a ground floor corner shop and I've got some flats above me. And using this guidance, you might say, well, the shop is a low risk environment, but it's a simple risk environment. So therefore, the manager within that shop or the owner occupier should be able to assess that risk. But because they're sleeping accommodation above, those 2 or 3 staff actually now put it into a category where it's maybe not low risk, it's potentially medium or high risk with the type of property that we've created. So even with these definitions, and we look up close to them, they don't necessarily work in a way that I think is clear. We've also got the internal travel distances, and as it states here, less than 20 metres with no serious hazards. And next slide then. So this is where we start to look at the foundation level of risk assessment. And really, when we think about risk assessments at the foundation level, these should be for our low risk buildings. These are simple structures. And when we think about this does include residential buildings with families or people that are familiar, generally less than 15 in number, or retail or commercial buildings occupied by less than 15 people. And this is where an entry level kind of course, level 2, level 3 on the national framework will start to cover some of this criteria. As it says here, less than 3 stories high, internal travel distances less than 30 metres, and no abnormal hazards or substantial quantities of controlled products, so highly flammable, oxygen, stored oxygen, and generally will have less than 300 square metres. So I think on the whole, when we think about it, this is where most people following a level 2 or level 3 course, and they're entering the industry, this is those qualifications. So I've got some knowledge, but I don't have all the understanding and experience. So this is where we're going to start out. Now, some of the problems that we may face into the future is that lots of companies have been accredited against these national frameworks and standards, which are UCAS verified. And for some organisations, employees that may have lots of qualifications but not the experience may end up not only assessing at a foundation level, but they may go beyond that and they might start to assess at an intermediate level. Have the next slide, please. So the definitions at an intermediate level are building on what we've already seen. So this is for buildings that are defined, again, as a residential building, but less than 50 persons, which can sometimes be difficult to quantify because you can have 25, 30 apartments or flats in a building. How many residents in each of those apartments, it can be quite difficult. So going off the principle, if it's a 2-bed and there's a double room, then you're likely to have 3 people in it. We often will have quite small properties where we can have 50 persons present. This may include temporary or transient residents. So we started to think about HMOs, hostels, hotels, and these people particularly would be unfamiliar potentially with some of the fire safety arrangements. So we increase the risk, not necessarily because the activities are different, but the type of persons that might be there. This might also include shops and retail environments. And as it says, these will be occupied by less than 100 staff and members of the public. And that's not to say if there's an average of 110 people in the building, you shouldn't fall into this category. It's making that judgment call to say whether you're happy and consistent with that risk. But it does go on to say that there's less than 7 story in height, internal travel distances of less than 60 metres, no abnormal kind of hazard should be present, and with a floor area below 600 square metres. And these will have multiple unrestricted stairwells. Remember, with risk assessing, one stairwell is always written off as a fire exit in the event of an emergency because it's usually impeded by a fire. So we do our calculations on a reduced exit availability. And it should be substantially clad with combustible or unknown materials. So lots of buildings have been clad. They've had a different aesthetics on the external side of the building. But one of the other things, just on that note, and thing that we're seeing is that lots of buildings now are having a lot of vinyl coverings. They're having these timber walls, like media walls that are put into buildings, and there are often long exit routes leading to stairwells. So all of those things may then trigger this intermediate level based on what's in the building, increasing to a more significant risk. Okay, and then the next slide. So we're then looking at our advanced level of fire risk assessment, and this should be reserved, as it says here, for those who have demonstrated competency at the highest level. This is high level buildings. They're defined as those that are 80 metres or over, but also include a number of different types of properties. Residential buildings occupied by over 50 residents. Those that may be familiar with the building be present. There might be individuals that have some impairment, special needs, particularly in retail and commercial buildings with over 100 staff and members of the public, for your large shopping centres. That can be problematic because of the human behaviour factor, and people sometimes losing children, loved ones, walking towards the danger rather than leaving. If they exceed their 7-story height above ground level, or they have occupancy below ground level with no direct egress to ground. Internal travel distances may exceed 60 metres. There might be abnormal or other transient hazards, exceed a floor area of greater than 600 square metres. Stairways can be complicated, and those exit routes may not be familiar and easily people directed to them. And again, cladding and other combustibles might be present, or they have simply a lack of fire protection and other mitigating measures. And actually, when we start to think about the levels that we then fall into, and going through this kind of the foundation, intermediate and advanced levels, there is much more to this framework than meets the eye, because I don't think it's as black and white as we see on the screen here. We need to have a far better quality of competence that can assess us. And the skills that we have, our principal skills as risk assessors, need to be based around our attitude, our experience, our behaviour, before we even start to look at the type of property we may be working in. Next slide, please. So with the standard, the full standard can be found on the Fire Sector Federation website. So it's firesectorfederation.co.uk, fire risk assessment. And without kind of reading through all of the issues and things that we've discussed so far today, it's really important that I think you go to the back of that document and you look at each of the levels. So here we've got just two snippets out of there. And what it says is that we need to have professional knowledge, and we need to have principal skills, experience, as well as behavioural skills. And there's a number of questions. And what's really good as an activity, and this is something that I went through with a colleague some time ago, is you look at these standards and just highlight, highlight which ones you meet the requirements of. Because if you can demonstrate that you meet those requirements at a foundation level, then you will meet the requirements of undertaking a risk assessment for low and simple risk buildings. Once you've done that, you move on to the intermediate level, and you start to look at those questions. Can you demonstrate? Can you fulfill those requirements? And can you ensure that when you undertake a risk assessment, all of these areas of subject knowledge from the Fire Sector Federation have been met? And if we go beyond that to each of the three levels, you'll find out where each of you, your staff, you sit on this framework, and that's the point where you should limit yourself. That will help you to then create a strategy for further improvement, the CPD, but also it will help you to highlight where those gaps are. So before I kind of get towards the end and I finish, you can go on to the next slide. I have a question, and the question is really aimed at what me and at you, and it says, where do you sit on the framework? Now, I don't expect any of you to find yourself now to be able to answer that question, because it's more of a complex exercise. But personally, I know that I meet the requirements for principal skills at advanced level. I've been working in fire safety and delivering complex fire risk assessments for a while now. But I can't be recognised as a Tier 3 fire risk assessment on the IIRSM framework, because that sits as a UCAS accredited body under something like BAFE SP2 and 05 under their framework. So unfortunately, I sit below that at Tier 2 as a risk assessor. But when you ask the question even more, should I be on the Tier 2 risk assessment? Actually, I should only be assessing the foundation level, because I don't meet one of the requirements. And the requirement I don't meet is this: demonstrate a commitment to becoming a proficient fire risk assessor by regular reviews of own work. How many of you regularly review your own work? So after you've undertaken a fire risk assessment or any risk assessment, do you go back to it in a month's time and have a look and review your work to question whether what you've put in there is accurate? Have you shown a little bit of ability to have a reflective account of the work you've been doing? And actually, I think we'll find that the majority of us don't have the time. So whilst I might say to myself, yes, I can do advanced fire risk assessment work, the reality is very rarely will I ever go back and look at my own work. That's not to say that we don't have quality assurance processes in place. That's not to say that we're not able to demonstrate that we have somebody within the company looking to make sure we've dotted our I's and crossed our T's. But the only way we're truly going to learn and improve is if we uphold high standards and we use guidance, whether it's existing, whether it's from manufacturers, whether it's improved code of practice, or whether it's something that we've discussed on a webinar, or from a specialist engineer or person that we've discussed with. Unless we go back and learn lessons and make changes to our templates and our plans, we may face gaps within our risk assessment strategies. Next slide. So this is where I see the problem. Qualifications. On a regular basis, I get asked the question, or I see the question on social media, where do I start? And with so many certificates, diplomas, degrees, and specialist qualifications available, it makes it really hard to decide where to start. I'm a massive advocate for regulated training, webinars, and other sources of information to assist us. When I started on my journey for fire risk assessment, I started with the one in the middle, the NEBOSH Level 3 fire certificate. So it's fire risk management, and it included fire risk assessment. Now, that qualification at the moment, the total qualification time is 56 hours. And lots of people within the industry will look at this qualification and say, hold on, that's not many hours. And it might not be, but it's all about that prior learning and that assessment. And you do come out of there as a risk assessor. But when I did that, that was classed as an advanced fire risk assessment qualification for higher or more complex risk buildings. But the reality is, it's not anymore. That's for your low or medium risk. And when you look at other level 3 qualifications, such as the level 3 fire qualification from fire call on the right-hand side, that has a total qualification. It's spent over 2 weeks, so it's roughly 80 hours. I'm not 100% exact on that. But if you look at the ABBE, the Award for the Built Environment, that's a total qualification time of 300 hours. But they all sit at level 3. So I think it's really important that you look at the framework, look at what the Fire Sector Federation is saying about these benchmark standards, look at where you sit and what qualifications you have. And it's not to say one of these qualifications is better than others, but it's making sure you book yourself onto the right training course and you have the right people around you to support what you're doing. And then onto the next slide, please. And so that brings me kind of to the end. And the reason I called it the turkey twizzler effect is because I think with so many of the standards and the practices that we had in the past, we're still sticking to them. Whether that's the fire extinguisher engineer that's always done it in a particular way, or whether it's the fire risk assessor that just puts yes or no in a box. Just because that's the way that we used to do it in the past, we need to change. And just like we need to change, I wouldn't recommend eating turkey twizzlers for your general health. So that brings me to the end. Thank you for your patience, the IT problems. If you have any questions, I'm not sure how much time we've got, Rob. If there are any questions, I can try to answer them.
There's been a couple of messages come through, and thanks again for everybody for hanging around. First one, I think it's probably only 10 days in, a little bit pre-Amazon. Will there be any changes with Labour through the government?
No, I don't think there will be. At the moment, it's actually a question that I kind of at the start of the presentation. I don't think Labour have got a lot of things to deal with, and they've hit the ground running, which is really positive. But I don't think there's going to be any real appetite from the government to say, look, this is what we need to change and we need to implement it now. The fact that there's a working group and it's working with all sector, the whole sector to influence change, I think there's probably going to be at least 12 to 18 months before we see a bit more groundwork on whether you should or you must, or even insurers are saying, look, if you pick a risk assessor, it needs to be off of this framework. We didn't have it with health and safety. I don't think we're going to get it with fire, and I don't think there's an appetite from this government either at the moment. Not to say it won't change, but I don't believe it, and I don't understand it at the moment.
Yep. And the last one, I think John was pointing out, in the Republic of Ireland, the role is quite specific.
In the Republic, not Northern Ireland, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I know a little bit about the Health, Safety and Welfare Act. I think it's 2005. I don't know much about within the Republic, but we have had some greater wording with fire safety because of the introduction of the Fire Safety Act, Building Safety Act, fire safety regulations. And it might mean that there is maybe a review of the regulatory fire safety order, and it creates this almost, you need to have an internal appointed person, and you need to have, if they're not internal, they need to be someone that is a competent person to get to framework. But again, because we haven't legislated or we haven't told everyone to go down the Austria consultancy route, I can't see it happening anytime soon. The reason we need to change and move forwards is more about it's the right thing to do. And change will probably only really happen in its first instance when it comes down to the insurers starting to dictate what they want to see. And we are seeing a little bit of that through organisations like Construction Line. They're putting more questions in their framework for businesses to be compliant, to demonstrate you have a better, wider reach of compliance. What will actually happen in the future, I wouldn't want to say. I sound like a politician, so I'm sorry if that doesn't answer the question.
No, that's okay. Well, there are a few that come through. If anybody else has any questions, please filter them through to us, and then we can pass them on to Phil, and he'll be able to come back with some answers for you.
Thank you.
So I think, I'll hand over back to Julie or Tony.
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you everyone for bearing with us with the sound issues. You can never predict when people have IT issues and the gremlins arrive. So thank you, Phil, for also bearing with us. I know it's quite torturous for you at the beginning, but thank you. Thank you for an excellent presentation and soldiering on. I will upload the presentation onto the IIRSM YouTube channel in the next couple of days, but I've just had one more question. So let's just see if this is a quick one. You stated that the NEBOSH is only 56 hours, but please remind me that you need the general certificate to pass the NEBOSH fire.
No.
Okay.
No, so maybe this is, I'll try to be as quick as possible. So yeah, you're correct in thinking. So with NEBOSH, it was modular form. So if you completed National General Certificate 1 the first week, that gave you underpinning health and safety legal knowledge. Then week 2 would have been the fire part. But because of various changes that were happening within the wider kind of training sector, that was removed. So you could argue if you put week 1 onto that week 2, the general certificate, and you did the fire, that's more of a more rounded qualification, and it's close to that 80 hours. But it sets as a standalone question qualification now, and it's separated in that way. But that said, depending on, and obviously I'm an advocate because I spend a lot of my life teaching fire safety. That said, for a lot of people, the NEBOSH is a really good starting point. And the biggest problem that I think we have is, don't go away from any of these qualifications, whether you've done 300 hours or 50, 60 hours, thinking that you'll have all the answers, because I've been doing this for 20 years and there's still a lot that I don't know. But yeah, it's now just a standalone 4.5-day course.
Great, thank you, Phil. Thank you so much for today's presentation. Thank you, Robert, for chairing. And thanks everyone for bearing with us. And hopefully we'll see you at our next branch webinar.
That's great. Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.